Today's episode of The Bluff is sponsored by SitRep. SitRep is a notorious open source intelligence app that provides the latest updates for over 180 countries and over 500 topics, allowing you to stay ahead and informed. Now available on Apple and Google. Thank you, SitRep, for sponsoring this episode.
Welcome back to the Bottom Line Up Front on our Artorias podcast. I'm Matt.
And I'm Stefano, the Chief Intelligence Officer of Artorias. And today we're joined by a very special guest who recently participated in one of our X spaces under SitRep, in which we talked about online radicalization and the use of social media, Western civilization in Western countries, and how we're seeing those tactics of radicalization and normalization of violence being copied from other parts of the world. And we really wanted to expand this conversation for this podcast to give our listeners and viewers a different perspective. And so if you've listened to our episodes in the past, we generally focus on specific conflicts or geopolitical arenas. But we also wanted to talk about certain capabilities. And the first one we did was about drones around the world and their case use. But this one's a little bit different. Online radicalization and the normalization of violence. And with this, I am very happy to introduce our guest speaker today, Rosalie. Rosalie, thank you so much for joining us. Please give our listeners a little bit of your background before we have this very important conversation.
Yeah, so my background is kind of at the intersection of public health and national security. I did my graduate studies at Johns Hopkins, and I focused on the threat of information manipulation during crises, like the unique way in which that makes us vulnerable. Um, and when I graduated, I think it was in 2022, I really didn't see a role for the work that I wanted to do out there. And so I founded InfoEpi Lab to start um, doing this work at the intersection of public health and national security. And so I have now been working for several years on different malign influence projects. Yeah, so they're very broad. Like sometimes people will be like, "What is the uniting feature in like all of these topics that you'll work with?" So.
And I think that's a phenomenal way to start this conversation because we're going to talk about a lot of different case examples. And the first one I wanted to ask you was, kind of a case study that you saw of Russia's security services or maybe groups associated with the Russian state, recruiting almost basically up to teenagers to conduct sabotage attacks across the West. And so my question for you in that, what are the tactics that, these Russian groups or pro-Russian groups use? Who do they target? What are the methods? What's the messaging? What have you seen when Russia conducts recruiting to then conduct sabotage attacks against, let's say, NATO countries or European Union countries and infrastructure?
Sure. So this has become more common, I think, first of all, because of the loss of the human assets that Russia's had since 2022. Um, but one of the ways that they are patching that, loss of information is that they're identifying people who they can quickly recruit that have the access that's needed for whatever it is they want them to do. And they're looking for people who are pliable, and that will naturally lead one to look for teenagers because they're very impulsive. The stage that they are in or their cognitive development is such that I think a lot of parents will probably like identify with thinking like what were you thinking, and it's just their minds are not working like adult minds yet. And Russia is exploiting that. Some of the things that they look for is economic vulnerability. So, families that are facing hardships, they don't have steady income because then they can sometimes do very limited legwork ahead of time to bring somebody in if there is economic hardship. But they're also doing like social media profiling. um, they'll put up false like job opportunities that sort of mask what they're doing. And I'm not sure that in every case that the minors in particular, like that they know like who they're working for. I'm not sure that that's always the case. Um, but they will start like a trust building trust with these individuals, and that will happen very often on Telegram. Almost 90% of kids in Ukraine are teens, I'm sorry, are on Telegram. So that is a good platform if you're wanting to speak to them privately. And so there is a lot of recruiting that goes on there. um, but they're also looking, like identifying family members who may have information about things related to the military. That's always a concern. Um, and so they're really looking using the online information environment to their advantage in order to then bring it into the physical world. And there's been several really alarming cases. One in particular was there were two teens, and it ended up being like a suicide attack. And one of them died, and the other was injured. And so these are not just it's not just like them getting intelligence and then delivering it to Russia, but there is real harm happening.
So, Rosalie, you brought up a very interesting case of 2 points that I think is important to highlight. Number one, you brought up an issue of how we've seen Russia's degradation of their intelligence services, presence specifically in the West, really hamper their ability and kind of force them into the online space. It's actually interesting. Today, I actually saw a very interesting report from SITREP in which Moldova conducted massive raids targeting hundreds of Russian associated people inside of Moldova, and they were targeting everything from economic influence, a military threat, even, and their intelligence services threat, but more importantly, even their information space, and targeting a lot of like pro-Kremlin, pro-Russian influencers within Moldova, and how the Moldovan leadership kind of presented this raise was kind of like the threat of the integrity of the Moldovan nation state in itself. But one of the key aspects was they targeted even the information space. But you really brought up this very interesting case study of how Russia has been forced to move to the information warfare area and to the information operation into online because of the degradation of their intelligence presence has been severely degraded since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But another aspect I wanted to ask, kind of a follow up question, is you brought up kind of this economic disadvantage that Russians are recruiting specifically members with less economic means that maybe come from broken households, younger adults, et cetera. So my question for you, just to kind of reinforce this, is there mostly from the case studies you've seen is more tied to that? Is there the way the Russians recruit them is from an economic perspective, saying, hey, we will give you additional money? Or is there certain, let's say, political or policy messages that the Russians are looking for recruitment? What are you seeing most, the economics or kind of that propaganda, nationalism, anti-Western ideology?
So I would say in the case of the kids, the cases that I've seen, and this may not be representative, although I think it probably is. um, you know, Things like a girl who she didn't even know for sure who she was working for. She was told to take a package to a police department in Ukraine, and they were going to detonate an explosive, which would have killed her. Um, and they offered her something. I think it was the equivalent of maybe 2,000 USD or something like that. Like it's they're large sums of money, but they're not like, so big that there's like probably money laundering that or anything like that. So I think that the money and economic hardship is probably the driver, particularly with minors.
And so when they're finding, you talk about the economic aspect, but are they also utilizing, what we've seen in other cases, uh, utilizing algorithms or finding pre-existing groups that they can sort of worm their way into, or take members from the fringe of those groups? We hear a lot about the talk of the memification of propaganda. Is that something you're seeing in this sphere at all?
Um, Definitely what you're describing is something that I've seen. Russia, I think, is very good at constantly throwing stuff at the wall, and they're just always throwing stuff at the wall. So they're kind of doing any and all things. With the kids in particular, I'm not seeing anything like that. And I doubt that it's happening in a meaningful way. And here's why. So the kids are treated as disposable assets, like one-time use. So even if they survive whatever it is they're having them do, they are done. Russia is done with them when they're burned. And so it doesn't make sense to then, like devote time to getting into a network, because the approach here is also really different to where their human intelligence of people living on site and developing years long relationships. This is very different in the nature of how they're treating these individuals.
Well, that's interesting. It's interesting because it's coming one from a state level actor. So I think it's different than what a lot of people, myself included, tend to think of when we think of these these organizations that tend to lean towards online radicalization. But the end result is very similar in that when these organizations, if we're talking about white supremacist organizations or Salafist jihadist organizations, the end goal there has often been for the lone wolf type attack and inspiring that type of attack. Now, this sounds more coordinated on the side of the Russians with a specific end goal in mind. But again, it does highlight the risks of being able to isolate a person who is susceptible to this type of recruitment and then getting them to conduct acts on behalf of, in this case, a state actor. So, do you think that they're learning from these trends that we've seen from other organizations like the Islamic State? Or do you think this is something completely separate?
I think anybody and everybody who is an influence actor in the information space is in one way or another affected by what is happening in the jihadist sphere. I very often pioneer in this space before anybody even realizes what they've done. And so I think a lot of what they've done to, can be surprisingly effective. And I absolutely think that they learn from one another. And that is something that I've observed kind of in an adjacent space, unfortunately. So, nation states, when they're doing influence operations, what we would characterize as malign influence, you know, it was private industries that really pioneered in this, and I think became effective and kind of mapped out what an effective campaign is from top to bottom. And I very much believe that these groups learn from each other, and like in real time, whether that was intentional or not, just they're very clearly quickly kind of mutating and taking whatever they can from other groups.
So let me take this opportunity then to ask a question that we discussed on this space. And again, the space is up. I highly recommend people listening to it. Uh, I remember just for the listeners, the Rosalie, you reached out to me shortly after the assassination of Charlie Kirk, saying, "Hey, we're noticing this trend on online discourse that I think is not getting enough attention, and kind of how violence is becoming normalized online." And one of the case studies you kind of brought up to me was specific. We would think as video games for children, and that should be very benevolent, right? Specifically, let's say Roblox and Minecraft, and how some of these algorithms for these games are actually getting children and teenagers into very violent, servers that kind of perpetuates this normalization of violence. And I would really like you to kind of expand on these kind of specific groups and organizations that really focus on. I mean, I remember you were mentioning specific organizations we're talking about it, but like this idea that Roblox is now becoming a vehicle to make younger children accept violence much more than probably video games have in the past.
Yeah, and I think I definitely want to like make a distinction here in like the exposure. So like just general not I don't want to downplay violence in video games, but like exposure to that, the evidence around it is sort of mixed. But I think what's very effective about this is it's not just like being the exposure, it's the engagement with a specific community. So I like to make that distinction because sometimes when I talk about this, what people hear is, oh, video games are bad and I should keep my kids away from it. That's not necessarily what I'm saying.
Right. So what would be the groups and actors
Sure.
that how they target these younger adults from a nefarious perspective in using video games? Because like
Mhm.
just for one example, I remember when the Charlie Kirk when the arrows and everybody said the up down the kind of the arrow symbols was from Helldivers 2, and I told people that's a very fun game. Like I play it. It's a great game, and in no way, shape, or form is it in a sense of perpetuating violence. But obviously, in other case examples, there's other organizations that do this from a much more nefarious activity to maybe engage that. And what have you seen in that arena?
So, um, platform movement, like jumping, is a huge part of this. So, um, let's say, for example, you're on like something like Pinterest or could be Instagram, something image based, and you're using um, hashtags or keywords that are very distinct. What these groups that would like to target minors will do is they will teach the algorithms of these platforms that Roblox, for example, and let's say Minecraft, because I don't just want to pick on them, it goes with this hashtag for, you know, um, cute core or whatever. And so then that is what then gets suggested to people in both of those groups, right? Because the algorithm's learning, oh, well, these two the people have this in common often, but they're really just simulating these totally unrelated um, ideas in inauthentic content. And I was very horrified. One platform in particular had a fairly active um, eating disorder community. These can be very, very toxic spaces that kind of overlap with physical self harm, like cutting and things like that. Well, if you have an individual who is a minor and they're engaged in one of these communities, an eating disorder community like these, it's a fair guess that they're probably not being supervised. Someone is not watching them. Like nobody is looking out for them because these are really dark communities. And so it's very easy for, a bad actor to say, okay, those are very vulnerable, insecure individuals, and it's pretty good chance that they're not supervised online. So then you've got that situation, and then you might have the recommendation algorithm feeding them right into the exact community that is seeking to prey on these individuals. And it will gradually, what happened when I was doing my research is, it started out like almost like movie props or people who were like very into theater. And then it really quickly became just very macabre. And it was only like it was only like three or four hops from my original piece of content. And I was just really struck by like it was like I said, I've gone over footage of war crimes. This was a really sickening content, and some of it was like AI gore, so there's like no end to the depravity that can be displayed. it was really, really concerning. And so what we know about these groups is that they will try to get kids to come off of whatever platform it is where they meet them, to get them into a space where, it's closed off. It's not going to be subject to platform moderation from a kid's platform, something like Telegram and Discord. And that is an aspect that I think is like the moving people around, I think is leading to people missing this happening. Um, Even though it's fairly obvious if you're looking at the whole picture.
Is that would be an example? Because I one of the
Mm.
one of the groups you were mentioning, I
Mm.
believe, if memory serves correctly, was the Order of the Nine Angels, or that was really, there's kind of like their end goal was really just violence in and of itself, right?
So,
And is that where you would see an example where they target a young member through the algorithms, get them in an area where it, very violent content, and then try to pry them off into, let's say, a Discord, Telegram, or WhatsApp, depending where you're on the world, and then try to recruit them into this very violent, almost like satanic organization, and then they conduct attacks. Is that kind of like a perfect case example that you would see?
the I think that was actually one of the questions we received was from an individual who's doing research on that group. But I remember that example, and it was very similar to the 764 cases that I had seen. And I don't know in all cases that they're necessarily part of the COM network, but it is that footprint, very macabre, exploitate or seeking out minors online, all of that sort of thing. I think something that is really common is getting these individuals using, basically exploiting their naivete to get them to somehow incriminate themselves. So, although in a very different way, their will in the situation becomes compromised, and that is what they're going for. And then they will push the individuals, once they have whatever that blackmail material is, to make even more graphic content, that I won't get into, is just very disturbing. And then these individuals who are abused and brought into these groups then go on to become perpetrators themselves. So that's sort of the cycle. And in fact, if you get on Twitter, um, if you look up like spawning, that is what they're talking about. Them being brought in by their abusers, um, and you will be shocked. Like, what platforms allow to stay online, even when it's like openly like preying on children. It's baffling, um to see things like this happening.
Can you, and sorry, Matt, just for our listeners, I think it's very important. I think it was the 764. Correct me if I'm wrong. Is that the individual, the child? I think he was 17 years old who actually killed his parents, if I'm not mistaken. Can you give that? Can you lay that case out just so there's like an actual case of how? Because I think that was very informative in the space, and I think it would give our listeners a really understanding of what something, how it starts and how it actually ends, and then even the law enforcement response from there.
So you're talking about this jumping from platform to platform, and I think like obviously that is a tactic to the recruitment side of things and a way to get people into space that the organization or the group that is trying to radicalize in this case younger folks into a space that they feel like they own, but it also provides a level of resilience because they end up moving
Yes.
people to things like encrypted chat. And so how do you combat that, do you think? Because every time you take something like that down, they're going to be able to pop up elsewhere, especially if these people are exposed to these groups on multiple platforms.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. Some of this is is for resilience. And, the example you brought up before, I'm not sure if it was ISIS who started doing this first, but basically their content would get taken down pretty quickly. And so they started creating like decentralized distribution, like putting stuff in places that was more resistant, even if they couldn't like directly post it online.
So I think one of the aspects was what we're seeing as the common thread is, and like kind of all these different cases that you're mentioning is, a kind of a pipeline, and I think that's the line, the term we're using a lot for kind of this, maybe not necessarily radicalization per se, because there's themes of blackmail, coercion, and I think that might be a little bit different than from kind of like the ISIS example, right? Where it was really the purpose was to have people kind of really fall in the ideology. And this one is more geared towards a lot of these case examples are either economic disadvantage or in many cases just straight up blackmail. So I guess for you, Rosalie, like, for people that are kind of concerned about this, is this a situation where you would recommend maybe there might has to be more severe laws forcing these organizations to be much more cooperative? Like, where do you think or maybe there is no solution like in this online space? What do you think?
So we know that with proper motivation, that some of these platforms can deal with things really, really quickly. In an example, there's a platform that there was human trafficking going on pretty openly on the platform. They said they couldn't do anything about it, and this almost led them to be removed from the iTunes store because Apple more or less decides what the how bad things can get online basically by what they'll allow in the app store. And it was days, and they had everything that had concerned researchers, like they had it taken offline. So I really want the audience to understand is these platforms will say they do not have solutions, that they cannot possibly afford it. Yes, they can. They do not want to, and that is different. Um, these the amount of solutions that they have, I always tell people, if you do not think that they can catch content anywhere that it enters their platform, try to upload a copyrighted song and let me know how it goes, how long it lasts on, or a movie. Try to put that on YouTube. You will get caught very quickly. And that's because if they have a financial incentive, which they do, they don't want to be sued, then they act.
It's funny, Rosalie, because one of the case examples that I've noticed for this, Roblox is a perfect case example for my own coverage. I've seen Mexican cartels use very similar tactics that you guys have kind of mentioned for recruitment. I've seen servers being created in Roblox with straight up cartel propaganda, where you act as a cartel member and you have all their symbology, ability to act as a cartel member. And it's a way to then kind of very similar. Then from that, they have private conversations, and then they might try to isolate you away from, a messaging group, which in Mexico, it's WhatsApp. Everything runs on WhatsApp. And then they even try to recruit minors. And what I've noticed is in that construct, so it serves as a recruitment perspective, it serves as a propaganda perspective as well. But I think one of the case examples that I think is kind of getting missed, that I do believe it's also very similar, especially in the non-state actor realm, is this idea of just the normalization of violence. And it almost in itself is that's just the end goal. And, we've seen this with mass shootings, where sometimes it's even a competition from these shooters, where they tie back into previous mass shootings in a way to say, see, I can get more. But another one is, and specifically in the Mexican cartels piece, where I've seen this a lot, even inside of Mexico, is just the normalization of violence within the society. And I think, a perfect example is, when we see, horrific images out of Mexico in which violence, you see dismembered body parts. you generally get this response of saying, well, whoever was killed was probably involved in cartel business, and obviously, if you're involved in cartel business, you had it coming, and that's the wrong answer. That's the wrong answer, but that's just become so prevalent within society, specifically in Mexico, where violence has become normalized and where it kind of shows where, in the end of the day, a lot of these cartels, either deliberately or unconsciously, that's what they achieved, enabling them then to conduct more violence. And then it's almost to the point where who can be much more violent, who can be much more gorish. And unfortunately, in some of these conversations that we're having, maybe outside of the Russia piece, because they have a specific objective in mind, within the non-state actors, specifically in these new types of groups in the West and in Mexican cartels, it almost identifies that maybe the end goal is not necessarily a political objective or an economic objective, but it's more just normalizing violence. And that may be, in a way, a common thread within all of these organizations, that they're convincing people who they're radicalizing and who they're recruiting that violence is normal, that violence is acceptable, and even maybe it sets a step so far as to say that violence is desirable. And I think that is a huge problem, that a lot of the conversations that are, though different in many ways, shape, or form, the end goal is violence is desirable, and that's what they push their members to do. And I think that's a very worrisome case, because in Mexico, like I said, it's become accepted, it's become excused even. And I fear that many of these organizations wish similar outcomes in other parts of the world.
Think you're very right about that normalization of violence, and whether it's happening intentionally or in some cases just because you you got on X and the first video you see is terrible. The effect that this has on individuals, we know, is real. It's well studied in war correspondence. And I think that sometimes we tell ourselves, because it's an image or it's media, that it's not affecting me exactly like if I were there. But it's not the same as it not doing you any harm. And so when we have situation like what happened to Charlie Kirk, that video was terrible. And I heard from so many people that their kids saw it and they are horrified, and they're angry that their kids, that's what their child saw. But there are going to be long-term consequences to exposing people to this violence.
And I think that also plays into what we were talking about with the algorithms. In some cases, you have organizations that are training the algorithms on purpose. But in the case of X, like, I do think, and this is where applying pressure to some of these platforms might be useful. I do think that the X algorithm has either organically or has been tailored in a way that that type of information is readily available and popped up on a lot of people's feeds. People who maybe don't follow the same accounts that we might follow, and caught a lot of people off guard. And I think that's where there can be a larger conversation about how to work with these companies to realize the knock-on effects of that. And just to your point, Stefano, when talking about this normalization of violence, I think of the example of the Wagner Group, which I was monitoring a lot of the telegrams that were following them, even prior to uh, the full-on invasion of Ukraine. But they were utilizing that a lot in terms of memifying their actions and the violence. So one of the things that you would see is there was a horrific video that members of the Wagner Group put out of them torturing and executing a member of the Syrian armed forces, who had abandoned his post. And he was hunted down, he was found by the Wagner forces, and then he was executed. And part of that involved a sledgehammer. But then what you would see in these online communities in reference to that, without actually stating it or talking about it or discussing it, it was celebrated with the emoji of a hammer. And so you would see that in the titles of the groups, you would see that in the emoji options that they had, or in response to comments made by other members as celebration or affirmation of the content that had been posted by another member. And to that point, this was not being used to recruit Wagner members at this point. This was just being used to create support for Wagner and Prigozhin within Russia itself. So it is something that's kind of moved on from the origins that we saw with ISIS, where it might not even necessarily involve the creation of a community, to much more community centric and cross platforms. And I also tend to agree with what you were saying, Rosalie, in terms of the ability that these platforms have to monitor and to take down the most harmful aspects of this information, because these organizations are using things like AI as a tech force multiplier. But those AI tools that they're using in a lot of cases are developed by those organizations, and they can use that same sort of technology to help take some of this down. So I think there needs to be pressure on the organizations and lawmakers to change how we interact with it.
I think the emoji is such, because I've seen that in Mexico, and I think, Matt, that's a
Hmm.
perfect thing. Emojis are widely used in Mexican cartels. It is a way that they communicate. And the sledgehammer is an example. And important, like I just went on right now while you were discussing, and I put Wagner sledgehammer, and there are ample videos of this. And to your point, but it's not necessarily the videos of the violence, but it's the glorification of it. And that's the point. And I think that's a common thread, that it normalizes violence in a lot of these communities. And we've seen, for example, tying this back to Rosalie, to your example at the beginning with Russia, we've seen Russian Telegram and Russian military basically conducting extreme levels of violence against civilians, using especially drones, almost as a sport.
Yeah.
It's become a sport, and that's a problem.
Yeah, so I think that it's doubly harmful because it's obviously the individual that they're filming, but they're also using that content to terrorize the Ukrainian population. And so we're able to see that I think bad actors are more able than ever to reach into our homes, into like our most reserved spaces, and to bring that violence there. And I think that's kind of something that has become different kind of across, is how, I don't think intimate is the right word, but just sort of how personal this contact can be. Um, and the violence, the tolerating it, that then necessarily makes room for whoever the most violent actor is that's going to maintain power that way. Because, of course, you do not want people getting angry about murders if you're the cartel and you want to operate, because that's like standard operating procedure. So they're kind of conditioning a population in some cases.
Yeah, I think it's twofold, like you were saying, because you are conditioning people to accept that level of violence. Um, and you're also creating an atmosphere of fear for those that they would see as an enemy. It also can provide a filter for the recruitment side, because the people who are most engaged with that type of information that's being dispersed by the organization are primed, and clearly already radicalized. And that's where what we've seen a lot traditionally with online radicalization and recruitment, it's not always recruitment into that specific community. The big threat comes from lone wolf actors and small groups. And that's what we saw with Nice. So the
Mhm.
strategy used in the truck attack in Nice was directly taken from a magazine that Al Qaeda used to put out called Inspire. And that was just putting out the information on how to conduct that type of attack, not targeting any specific person, but plugging into an organization or a loose organization of people who were seeking out that information and had already been radicalized. And that's where, as you get people normalized to this, you are by default creating certain people or identifying certain people who are more okay or even drawn to that type of violence. And that's going to be very difficult to combat. And it's something that we've been seeing, well over a decade at this point.
And just to reinforce one of the points that you said about the violence that I think is important to highlight, Matt, is it becomes, you have to inherently become more violent as a deterrence. And I've seen that personally within the Mexican cartel construct, which is violence is the deterrence, and it's the normalization of the violence enables you to do it. And that's why these cartel members continue to act in much more violent ways, because if they don't, they lose that deterrence. And so part of that is the normalization, which unfortunately in Mexico has been normalized. And I think there's other case examples where you can look around the world and show that it's also become acceptable. And it's not, and I think that's the fundamental difference. I think there's a difference between normalization and acceptance. And I think and I think that is a Rubicon that many organizations are pushing for. I think when we're seeing Russian Telegram and how they're acting in Ukraine, it's becoming, it's almost, it becomes unacceptable if you do not inherently become violent, if you do not execute prisoners of war, if you do not conduct attacks against Ukrainian civilians, if you do not, and not only if you do not attack it, but you have to record it and then distribute it. It's become part of the rubric in a lot of aspects of the Russian military, and that's how we do it. And I think, for example, October 7th at Hamas, how they, within their own Telegram channels, how they widely distributed that. And you can look at other case examples in the IDF and some of the aspects how they operate inside and how they normalize it. And I think that's a fundamental problem that is just in the state actor and the non-state actors, but that commonality. And I think that is the fundamental problem that we're running into, that although online communications have been incredible to connect communities and specifically those that might have been disadvantaged and isolated, give them in a breath of community that they can be able to reach out to, but how there these nefarious actors, either state or non-state actors, exploit that for their own personal or political gains. And that's what's being maximized right now. And I think that's not the conversation of online radicalization, I think in a lot of aspects falls within the political discourse, which is doing a disservice to all, when it should be a much more broad conversation of the methods that are used and the end goals in the end, because you can have political differences, but political violence is a step too far. And unfortunately, I think our political discourse right now is not enabling that in-depth conversation that is required to really combat that. But Rosalie, I did want to thank you very much for your time. I recommend everybody to follow you and look at your project, your InfoEpi Lab. I think you do phenomenal work really doing this. I know both in this conversation, in this podcast, in the space that we had, and the conversations that we have ever since. It's always, each case is separate, but there's commonalities, and analyzing those commonalities gives us a better understanding. And I think I just think that this is one of those topics that I think has been, I don't know if the word corrupted is the right way, but it's become such a hot topic issue that anytime you want to talk about online radicalization, it gets too political. And there are ways you can have this conversation in a real nonpartisan way. And I think policymakers seriously need to look in all these different groups and actors, from racially motivated violent extremists to eco-terrorism, right? I mean, a lot of these groups that fall within that specific threshold, that's the next step, is that the violence is accepted and normalized, and they take steps to do that from a political lens that then incentivize people to conduct acts of terrorism from an echo perspective. And that's not an okay aspect. That's never should be acceptable. And I think this is a fundamental conversation that needs to happen. I really appreciate your work. And I really recommend everybody, please look at our work. Please look at this episode. Please look at our space, because there's a lot of aspects that are simply put being absolutely ignored.
Yes. So I also want to thank you for coming on. I think a lot of this sounds very overwhelming. A lot of it sounds very negative, but I think the first step to combating it is having a conversation and making sure that people are aware that this is out there and, being able to see indications when someone close to them is maybe falling into some of these circles. So thank you so much for your time today. This has been the Bottom Line Up Front on Artorias podcast, and we will talk to you soon.